Welcome everyone to Talkback Tuesday. We have a special guest tonight, which I know that many of you know. This is the Reverend Canon Francis Amundi. Reverend Amundi has been a theologian in residence at University Presbyterian Church in 2004. He and his wife were visiting here last fall. He's familiar to many, many of you, and we're excited to have him tonight as we talk more about reconciliation, the work of the gospel, and what it means to live in a complex world. So we're really glad to have you, Francis, and delighted that you're here with us. And I wanted to start tonight by having you talk more about yourself and the work you're doing, where you're located, and some of the work that you're involved in.
Thank you, Nick. I'm glad to talk to you people again. I will sincerely missed being with you again during fall this year because of COVID. At the moment, we are in our work area. We work in the northern Kenya, where we've worked on the border with Somalia for the last 32 years. And we are experiencing this lockdown in a very different way. Our work has involved, we've been involved in this mission work, both in church as well as in the society, to help people know about Christ and to follow him. We've tried as hard as we can to make Christ known among the people that we minister to here. We've been grateful to have partnered with you at UPC. And my wife is doing well, and our sons are, all of us, I'm in school. And we've not been able to be with them here, but we are grateful they're all doing well. We are grateful also for your prayers and continued support for us, which has happened over the years. And we really look forward to seeing how God improves this as we go along. Thank you.
Francis, I know that you're aware of the divisiveness and the conflicts going on in the United States right now and the things we're facing. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of that kind of experience in Kenya, the kind of divisiveness and challenging divisions that Kenya has faced over the years.
Well, for long, we were called third world, and part of characteristics of our world was this kind of divisive politics and this unpredictability where of rulers who took great authority and were viewed truly corrupt. We never dreamt America would come to this point. So we've been watching things that have been happening for the last at least 4 years, when most of it has come to the surface, with great concern that if this happened in America, what will happen to us? For us, politics have never been a good point. We've seen it mostly as an orgy that always demanded blood, that always divided. People tried very hard to come together. All from independence in 1963, every year we had an election, we always had conflict, and that built up for the next one. We never really settled from election to another. The height of our greatest problems were in 2007. And in that, the country was polarized into two main groups. The one that supported the incumbent was then President Mwai Kibaki, and the others who supported the opposition were Raila Odinga. And one accused the other of being totally corrupt. But this did not only end in political sphere, they crept into the church. In Kenya, the church has been known to have greater impact in the society. And anything that happens in the church affects the society. And whatever then happens in the society reflects on the church. So that polarization was evident really in the church, that the tribes that supported one group were not having it. I mean, they were not sharing any longer with the tribes that supported the other group. Again, that dimension. Our politics is tribal rather than ideological. So you support because someone is of your ethnic group. And so groups that were perceived to belong to one ethnic group ended up supporting and belonging to one political party. So the conflict that was happening in the political arena spilled into the church, and the churches were divided such that if you had people praying, if one came from one community, they would be praying that God answer their prayers, the other person come into power. And if one came from the other community, they would pray, oh God, you have given us a new leader. So this penetrated into liturgy and into general life, and we were as divided in the church as we were in the country. So that had a lasting impact, and we have been working towards reconciliation from 2007. That we've hardly reached there. We still harbor those suspicions that we had from that time on. We've not patched up and agreed that we could fight and support each other, or politics on ideas rather than on ethnicity. You in America had it a little different, because we thought there were ideologies with the Republican Party or the Democrats. But we've seen the evisceration of boundaries. It's no longer that. People support even when the ideals of a particular party are not adhered to, only because one group, I mean, you become as tribal as we are, except that I can't tell which tribe one is. And I fear that this is penetrating and coming into churches also in America, with one group supposedly very Democrat, and another group really Republican. And you all know what that is. Our fear and our prayer is that God may give you, as always he has done, a way of discerning that and not allowing yourselves to come to that tribal grouping like we were back in Kenya, and that continue to ail us to this day.
So Francis, if you had a word to give to the church in the US, to give to our church in Seattle, because it does feel very tribal, as you described it, I think it's a very powerful image. What word would you want to say to us at UPC about that tribalism and how to combat it as followers of Jesus?
What we had, our problem was our tribalism focused on things here on earth. I mean, our ethnicity. Our tribalism was driven by our ethnicity. We ought to have understood that we had a bigger tribe, a tribe that we became part of at baptism, a tribe that broke down human barriers and made people of different ethnic groups, races, and people one community. The understanding that we are a community of faith whose hope is life in the world to come should have governed, for in our case, how we relate. When ethnicity overcomes the faith, I mean Christianity, when ethnicity becomes the key dividing factor, we lose our calling as ambassadors of Christ in the earth. If Christians up here and also now in America realize that we are ambassadors of Christ, agents of God's reconciliation in his world, we would behave a little differently. We would not yield to the polarization for whatever reasons. Being told that your big divide is whether people are socialists or people are capitalists. But we've never so deeply delved into what policies of capitalists are closer to text, to scriptural text, and what issues in socialists, among the socialists, are closer to text. I'm just hearing that discussion on healthcare. If one would not wish others get full healthcare, we would really not do well. So my thought is, I don't want to delve into that. My thought is, if we looked at what are these Christian principles, what are these things that God called us to do, how did he instruct us to view one another, that it's not race, is not because of his race, is not because of his status, but rather that they are all made in the image of God. That would help us begin to bridge that gap. If our faith helps us to look, if we look through the lens of our faith and look at our world through it, we would be really in a position to bridge those gaps, and it would make it easy for people to reconcile like electing our leaders. For us, had we looked at the mission from Jesus instructed his disciples, loving one another, caring for the weak, loving those who did not have means, and built ourselves in that in that form, we would not have agreed for politicians to divide us on any other thing, but we would have held them responsible for the policies that they ran.
One of the things that's happening around us
Hello?
is that politicians are, and our political parties, are describing one another in almost apocalyptic terms, that if you side with one or the other, it's really the end of the world. And so it, as you described, we get pulled into places of deep division and in many ways what looks like hatred, to say nothing of the long-standing divisions in our country where there's been true damage done. Think of our history of racism, of injustice in this country. And I wondered if you could talk us through more about the issue of reconciliation. And we can get into then talking more about Revelation 21 and the hope of the future. But when you think about the divisions that people face and the hostilities they face, especially when there's been physical damage to one another, what does reconciliation look like, and how do Christians even begin to enter into reconciliation when they've been so angry or so hurt?
That's a very interesting idea. When I think of these and what we went through, I thought I should look at it in three ways. The first one, I realized every time people were involved in an election that was quarreling and that had this kind of issues, we ended up hurting each other so dearly, so sorely. And this I drew the things we've had in the North with terrorism. Anytime a terrorist attacks and singles out and kills Christians and leaves the rest, we go through trauma. And that trauma would make you hate anyone who isn't of your faith and who you associate with those who inflicted the pain that you had. And what amazed me was this story, a biography of Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal wrote The Sunflower, and he picks one scene that made me really sit and think. In The Sunflower, Simon describes an incident from the time he was there as a prisoner in Lovelock Work Squad. He is summoned to be beside a dying Nazi soldier, Nazi young man, who wants him because he's a Jew. And he wants him so that he can grant him absolution for his participation in extermination of Jews. After listening to the young man's lengthy confession, this soldier's lengthy confession, Wiesenthal leaves the room without saying a word. In the story, he explains why he could not grant the man his wish for forgiveness, or he could not have forgiven him, because he felt he had no right to forgive on behalf of others. In this case, the people who were murdered by the man. Every time people have been through this, the question of guilt and forgiveness becomes an issue that as a community of faith we've got to deal with, because we invest so much in politics and we hurt each other. We call names, we really do things to people, and we certainly leave them wounded without knowing. And so when such an event happens, you find people remain quiet. People remain silent to each other. They cannot speak because they remember the things that happened to them. So I fear what I would do if I were this man. And I've always asked myself, if I was Simon, would I have gone to that hospital and told the man that I forgive you in the name of Christ? I don't know, because the harm was too heavy. It brings me then to the second picture. And this is Jeremiah's possible letter to the exiles. Find that in Jeremiah 29. And in this letter, the people had been lamenting. The Jews had come from Jerusalem, the town was burned, God did not answer their prayers. They were there who had survived, and now they were in labor camps, suffering. And they had hoped God would send them a word. And the word that came was pray for shalom for Babylon, not even praying for Jerusalem. And I think that triggered that Psalm 137 by the waters of Babylon, where they wished judgment came. So these people, the people of God, in their journey, were caught between lament, which they have been lamenting all along, and judgment. In their lament, they were crying and asking for God's judgment to come. But Jeremiah interjects with calling them to reconcile. He calls them to buy property, to give marriage, to give their daughters and sons for marriage. He calls them to pray for the well-being of this country, and much more. This was one of the precursors of loving your enemies. I found this fascinating. These people had an abiding hatred for the Babylonians who had captured them. And even Jeremiah writes 2 main chapters, 50 and 51, calling for damnation, final God's judgment on this. So we can be caught in that idea of praying for God destroying our enemy while from lament to asking God to destroy our enemies, not seeing that our calling in this case is a call to be God's ambassadors and to try to interject and bring reconciliation. And I see three things. One is that where there is lament, there is a fierce discussion, and we talk to God of situation the way it is. We've got to be honest with history and go deep and listen to both sides, the side of both the victim and the side of those who are victimized. It's in this situation that we will, in this kind of fierce conversation, that we would begin to understand the pains that everyone is going through. The second point is this provides us for a situation of lament. Lament is a fierce conversation that addresses God. It's not whining, but it is reaching a point when there is no solution that human being can provide, and one comes to a point of a dead end. But that is the point we refuse to despair, but live in this brokenness. We're facing God. It is not cynicism, but is accepting and hoping that God will still bring out of this. When we are aware of that, we then can leap into hope. And it's the hope that helps us to construct what would it have been if God helped. As one says, hope points us to the markers that God leaves on the way. That helps us not to despair. It's hope that keeps us from always lamenting, that will make us despair. So it is this that makes us as Christians to look at what good there is. In the middle of our post-election violence and destruction during our political problems, we still saw some people from getting help from very unexpected quarters. People who are not meant to support you came alongside you to support you. And even during terror attacks, I remember a sister traveling, a group of our Christians were traveling in a bus from Mandera, coming towards Nairobi. And on the road, they met terrorists. So this person decided all Muslims to go on one side and Christians were divided to go on the other side. So they knew Christians would be killed. So a group of Muslims gave another lady cloth to cover, head cover, and defended her, saying this is just one of our new Muslims. So you cannot kill a Muslim. And she survived with her life. We've seen people define what the general mood of everyone is, come towards supporting victims. So that gave hope that not everyone is in sync with the evil that is happening. Whenever we see that, we begin to realize that God is intervening and preparing us for the very end. But above all, the scriptural text, the word that we hear, we read, always gives us that hope that it will not end the way it is. We can always live looking at the crowd of witnesses, as we are told in Hebrews, who are watching, who are running this race with us. But the greatest have always been to know what we say in Psalm 23, that though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. To know that God groans, God suffers alongside us, gives us greater hope to cope with the issues that we face both politically and affecting us in the church.
That's incredibly powerful. And it's making me wonder then, what kind of a spiritual life is required in order to be able to embrace that kind of hope and live a life that does not give way to partisanship or division or violence or anger? What kind of a spiritual life is required of believers in order to be able to live a life as a kingdom person rather than simply a person of a political party or a person of the earth?
I found great help in the thoughts of one of our Emmanuel Katongole, one of our theologians. Actually is in Notre Dame, but a Ugandan, and he was pointing out that we need to live in this reconciliation. And when we read in 2 Corinthians 5:17 and 20, we see God lays this out, that because we are new creation, we are called to carry on this work of reconciliation. And it is a journey that God has begun and is inviting us to go. Many times, even I found in the questions, people ask, what can they do for reconciliation to take place? But we, as the kingdom people, need to enter and live in this reconciliation. It's a life we come into rather than an act, a skill we learn to perform. It's not a performance, but it's something that consumes us, that we simply becomes what God, we become tools that God would use to reconcile the world to himself. And he gave a few thoughts that I imbibed to make my own. And one is memory. I mean, we need to live with our feet on the ground and eyes on the clouds. That is, we live to practice this journey from knowing where we've come from and walking this journey with a direction where we are heading. And that is a journey. That's a journey from our creation, from our deliverance, and we are heading somewhere. So there are markers, things that should assist us as pilgrims to do this. And the first one is memory. We need to remember our journey from creation to new creation. From creation, and when we fall, things that make us fall, things that make the creation terrible, that calls on God to die and to try to transform us into new creation, and to understand where we are headed. And the only thing that makes us always remember this is when we gather for worship, when we share that bread. When we do that, we always remember what we will become when we gather before God. So the memory of our journey is very, very important. Memory does not select, it grounds and it says, this is the truth. This is what we've done to each other. This is where we've come from. And this is where we are going. To know we are God created in his image and we will be consumed in him makes us to value each other. And like C.S. Lewis says, that in the weight of glory, what will it be like seeing these people we've not seen as humans when the full weight of glory of Christ is upon them? They will be as glorious as Christ himself. The other point is lament. Lament helps us to learn to see, to learn to name, and to learn to live within brokenness without being in despair. It is in this creation that we agonize and we groan in anguish until God has done his work. In other words, anyone who laments is not lamenting of their own thing, it's engaging God within the situation that they see. That is very helpful for us if we are to be agents of reconciliation, because God's lament comes on us and we share his anguish and we share his agony. When that happens, we will see each other exceedingly differently, and therefore help each other in this journey and know what God is calling us to do. We will know what God is calling us to do, and we will share that anguish in a different way. Mm. The other is hope. The third is hope. Hope here is what keeps lament not to turn into despair. Hope is we see what God has done and what God is doing. In the process of our lament, we see his intervention. God is planting seeds. And that's what he says in Isaiah. Behold, I'm doing a new thing. We see a small ray of light that if we followed, we will walk into the great beam to see what God was planning to do for us. Hope is about seeing the signs that God is planting. We do not yet achieve what we are seeing, but we begin to see in neighborhoods, in small areas, people aiding each other. And I'm always proud of Seattle and how Seattle people turn on each other to support each other, even during the very hard racist issues. I've always seen God in a number of you. The third is advocacy. And according to Augustine, hope had two daughters. That is anger and courage. Advocacy speaks for the weak. And when you speak for the weak on issues that are not really affecting you, you will express anger at the way things are. You won't be satisfied. And you will also express courage, because it is courage that makes you begin wanting to do something about what you have been angry and annoyed about. This will help bring the new creation, the vision of the new creation in your society. But I finish with thinking about intimacy. It is not in the big picture of the society being transformed, poverty ending, and so forth, but it is about our invitation to stand within this creation that is broken, to stand with God in this intimate space, that we will commune with him, we will anguish with him, we will pray with the sick, we will pray with the poor, and endure the cross with them, celebrate their humanity, and in us, they will see God's presence manifested. I draw a lot of all this from my own experience in the North. As I said, on one hand, I'm very privileged in the sense that I'm educated, I'm Christian. I come from a background that the government would always want to support and protect me. And I live among a people that the government has always vilified. The last was when the government harassed the refugees and wanted every one of them in a camp or returned to Somalia. Anyone who stood on that one was perceived to be anti-government or supporting terrorism. I wrote a very influential piece to demand that the government not only protect them, but even consider giving them citizenship. I didn't have to do this, but in seeing the anguish that people who are not even of my faith, to come alongside them and see them as humans and stand my way, risk reputation, risk love, I realized this was one way of building reconciliation. I'm glad the High Court stopped the government, but part of this was, my article was used in one of the submissions. And I see that there is a way we can act as true agents of reconciliation. I remember after the Garissa attack and the slaughtering of teachers, many Christians had said, we are done. We don't want our people to go and serve and work among Muslims. And that wasn't, why should I say this? And that wasn't the way we should have responded as Christians. So again, I stood to talk to them and to Christians and church leaders and said, no, we've got to do what is right. What Christ demands of us is love, and even love our enemies. Love those who we perceive that we will not share anything with them. And the onus was on us to do what was right. For that reason, we insisted that where one has died, we've got to work to replace them and send and trust that God will now give us hope, strengthen, and protect us. That is the journey we've had, and that is how we've known what reconciliation is.
That's almost overwhelming. That's an amazing story and incredible guidance. But two things that strike me in this, and there are many things that I'd like to explore, but two things that I want to explore further is one, strikes me that in order to engage in lament and hope advocacy, you have to have a faith that is more than just religious, that there's an intensity about what you're talking about in your belief in a relationship to God that is more than simply church attendance or loyalty to church, but rather deep loyalty to God. And then secondly, it requires a belief in sin, that humanity is broken and there's something deeply sinful, broken about us that requires God's intervention, or else advocacy just is driven by anger or about my own conviction. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about the difference between simply being religious and being deeply Christian in order to engage in the life you described, and how our knowledge of sin or lack of belief in sin can impact whether we can engage in the kind of life you described.
Okay. Wow. All right. Now, I would like to, I think it was Al Palmer out here who always told us that if you wanted people to do what is right, give them the good. The good will always draw people out. If we looked at sinners or commitment or what we call nominal Christianity or the rest, we would fight over definitions of who really is in or who is out. I found the easy or the most striking approach to this had been to invite people to love Jesus. If people are in love with Christ, they will do anything. They will seek to know what he thinks. They will agonize with him. It's the intimacy with Christ that is the issue, rather than to keep laws or to keep a frame that these ones I will do or I will not do. I feel our call to discipleship has been a call to follow. When he says, come to me, he really meant that. He didn't call us to a doctrine. He didn't call us to a style or a religious order, but he called us to his person. And he demonstrated and illustrated how we ought to live who are followers of Christ. This chapter of Matthew 25, from verse 34, the parable of the sheep and the goat, has been a real eye-opener for me. It's not a question really of righteousness, but it's a question of Christ calling us to live justly, to live by the laws of the kingdom. When he said, I was hungry and you didn't feed me, I was thirsty and you didn't give me drink, I was in prison and you didn't visit me, I was sick and you didn't come to see me. The Lord was calling us, asking us, if you did not do to the least of this, you did not do that unto me. If we refocused away from doctrine, away from because I am told there are more divisive issues that are coming, whether in terms of personalities and others. If we focused and called people to Christ and called Christians in Seattle and others to follow this Christ, we would not miss the way. We would be in love with him. And when we are in love with him, we would agonize with what aches him. It was Tony Campolo, yes, who said that he would grieve with what would grieve Christ. That would rub on us. I pray that our discipleship should begin by helping us to see the historic Jesus and to see the demands that he calls us onto, and invite people to come and follow him again in our time. And it will be a robust discussion that someone in the streets of Seattle, if Jesus lived in these streets, how would he have reacted? What would he have done? And that would be a great indicator for us on how to follow Christ in that respect.
That's incredibly helpful and powerful as we try to understand what it means then to engage the living Christ and follow him as our first loyalty, so that he engulfs us and we are surrounded by him and his concerns, and that then we become truly citizens of heaven rather than citizens of whatever country
Yes.
we're in.
Yes, there were two wings to it. Sorry, let me interject here. The first one was to know Christ, like he says, come know him. And if we've gone that intimate with him, we will then begin to see where Christ hangs around, as it were. Is that American, where he hangs around?
Yes.
We will see the hoods where Jesus goes. A true understanding of Christ, a true hearing of him, where Jesus hangs on, among where are his buddies, where are the least of these. Then if we see him walking along where the least of these are, we would heed his invitation to come follow him even there. There are two things to it. He invited us to be with him. And as he goes out to the least of these, he invites us to follow him out there. So he may have left the sanctuary in that 4415 Avenue and moved to Kings County, deep on the other side of Trenton. And he would be calling us, come over, let's see what I'm about to do among these people. So that's the image, that's a picture I'm really seeing, that we would be his agent. You see, in that Corinthians text, say that we have been called to be his ambassadors. Ambassador is very familiar with his country's policy. I learned that an ambassador is not like the congressman. Congressman intrudes the ideas of the people he represents with his own. But an ambassador takes orders from whoever to carry on exactly what the state wants. If he's called us to be his ambassadors and agents of reconciliation, then it will be really important that we get the pulse that is in his heart and follow that on.
I want to, in our last few minutes, I want to shift and ask you about then, what does your personal devotional life look like? What are the practices that you find helpful in your own devotional life?
I'm not helpful there. It's jumbled. I had a plan, and here was the plan. I've used regularly for many years the daily office prayer that had a confession, a prayer, scriptures to read, to remind myself of the Lord's Prayer and to pray it in the morning, and also to share the creed, and also to take up, collect, we call them collects, but just prayers generally. But in my life, the greater thing that has happened to me has been setting up one day in a week to just sit, worship, to pray, and just to meditate and to reflect on God. That is a day of prayer for me. But when I became unwell, I was found with cancer 5 years ago, and the recovery disturbed my rhythm. But what I have recaptured is to have my 40 days fasting. I put my years in cycle of Lent and the rest. So Lent becomes a real devotional time for me. I would spend all the Lent with a light fast for the 40 days of Lent. And that will give me room to reflect for the year, to pray, and then take every day step by step, and 1 week every and then every week. It's a season of the year, 1 week, and then 1 day every morning or evening, depending on how the day was for me. But the focus has been to know and to every day breathe this word that I am his and he's called me to serve him. It's a dedication of life rather than a devotion of text.
Well, I think that's very helpful and a very good model of your passion and the way you desire to be known by God and to know God. And again, you're an example of what it means to let God shape you and to be his servant, a true ambassador. I think we wrestle in the US, especially especially from the majority culture side, with a sense that we give up our rights to ourselves so that we give way to his kingdom priorities, his passions, what you've said earlier several times about aching for the things that create ache in him, caring about his values and his interests. I think it's very, very hard for folks in the US, especially from the majority culture, and especially those of us who have access to wealth. It's very, very difficult to give way. And the issue that you're describing, that you haven't used the word, but it's all over your context, is that you've really come under his lordship and you've allowed Christ then to begin to tell you what to do and where he has sent you, and you go. It's very difficult here. And it's a topic we don't talk about much. It's very unpopular, I think, at the church right at this stage of life. But it strikes me that that's something that you live with every day.
Do you think it's because we have tried to codify and create ideas rather than a person that we follow?
Yes. Well, and I think there's a sense that, especially having lived on the East Coast in the North New England, and then now on the West Coast in the Northwest, both those places are places that are socially very progressive, concerned very much with social issues that are driven by some ways political ideology, and there are real good things in them. We care about justice and certainly want to be caring about political issues of the day, but it's often
is that justice according to John Rawls? Is that justice according to John Rawls, or justice according to this Christian? Because also the text, this translation of what we translated as righteousness, the keosune, was much more justice rather than righteousness. So that's why I thought of codifying it and not seeing that, look, it is just that we just follow him.
Yes. And so that is the problem, that it becomes a sense that my sense of justice is driven by my own anger or passion or my own guilt. And because often the folks that I know who are progressives, and I consider myself politically progressive, that there's this sense that because we can control so much of our world, that we can demand the world be like us. And so it's hard to give way and submit ourselves to another authority, because it requires that we give up our lives. And so it's very difficult to move from a place where I'm in charge of life and I have access to resources, I have money, I have a good life, I can protest and go home and never change. I can stand for justice and move back to my neighborhood. It never costs me anything. So then lordship becomes very difficult to deal with, because Jesus says, if you want to come after me, you have to give up your life. And we have a...
And that is what intimacy brings, because intimacy makes you want to pay something for it. You just don't talk it.
We need to underline that phrase. Intimacy makes you want to pay something for it. That's very powerful. If nothing else, that's one thing that I'm hoping everyone...
Thanks, Nick. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I'm very grateful that we had this chat, you see.
If we're almost out of time, and I'm aware of your time as well, but there are two things I want to end with. One is, again, I want to underline this phrase: intimacy makes you want to pay something for it. It costs you because you desire it so deeply. That's incredibly powerful. But I just want to end with, if you had something you wanted to say to the church in Seattle, as we think about the mess we're in at this point in our country, what are some of the things you'd want to make sure we heard from you today?
I've followed what happens in Seattle, and I've heard how you are vilified. I have heard someone call you hellhole country, city. I saw the pain of the increase in COVID and the agony you went through. There is both lament among you, people who are realistically complaining about the problems they are facing, the loss of jobs and the rest. I know many were touched also with the collapse of Max, the 373 Max, and things that are happening around Seattle. We can approach even this election with feeling victorious, or like now after this election, some could feel very victorious and gloat it over the others. But I think the greatest call we have is a call to enter into reconciliation. It's not something that we do, that you want to acquire skills to go and do it, but it's something that we are called into. It's to put our feet on the ground with our eyes to the clouds, and to remember who we are, agents of reconciliation, a new creation. And our newness comes because we've known Christ. And knowing Christ has helped us to realize that we can no longer see human from with our social lenses. That's the idea of not seeing man from the human point of view, but to see that in this person there is a glory of God awaiting just to crown them. And then this would call us to want to pray for shalom. If Seattle would be a shalom city, it will be because we've done the little things. We've allowed God to leave marks of hope in our society for this. We are not called to do big things, but in things that we were doing in White Center, in things that we are doing in the corners of our street, in the food that we distribute, that the hungry people don't go hungry in our city, in policies that we influence. It's in this that we become agents of reconciliation, because we do not have it fixed here. Seattle is not the best it should be, but the picture portrayed in Revelation is the best that we should aspire for. If we put our foot on the ground, we lament as hard as we can, but we work towards reconciliation and leave God to bring his judgment when he is ready. But as for us, we look forward to that city for which He's called us to.
Thank you so much, Reverend Francis. This has been an amazing hour. We look forward to the day when you can be with us in Seattle when COVID is done and you and your wife can come back and be with us again. Thank you so much for the investment in our church and in our community and certainly in the kingdom of God. And we want to welcome everyone to come back next week for Talkback Tuesday. We'll look forward to the day when you'll be able to actively interact with Reverend Francis, and we won't be recorded, but we're grateful for him joining us from Kenya. Thank you very much, and good night, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Good night.